one is called The Kingdom of Ends. And if you don't have a cup of coffee nearby, go ahead and go grab one. This one is a bit of a tough one. We find ourselves in 1785, Königsberg. So this is, I believe, now a part of Russia. At the time, though, it was Prussia, before German unification. And this is where a certain person published a book that will be of great interest to us today. This one is on Kant and deontology. Now, I've already been, in a way, warming you up for this one. If you think about it, we've already talked about Kant several times. So, in the lesson on philosophy of religion, we did mention Kant and how he divided up the different kinds of arguments for God's existence. We also looked at him on the lesson called Empiricism versus Rationalism. It is actually Kant who made that distinction between those two camps. And so in a way, I've been preparing for this for a very long time. So let's take a look at a little bit of context so we can try to begin to understand the work of Immanuel Kant. Kant is best understood in the context of the crisis of the Enlightenment. Newfound confidence in reason, beginning with the groundbreaking work of Isaac Newton, was leading many to question various traditional authorities, such as the clergy and the state. These are the same threats to tradition that we've already seen in this course. What is knowledge? Does God exist? Are we free? What is the source of morality? And others to come. Kant will ultimately attempt to argue that human understanding, in other words, the capacity to judge, is the source of the laws of nature, and that human reason, in other words, the capacity to infer, is the source of moral law, which is the basis for our belief in God, freedom, and the immortality of the soul. Kant's central thesis is that human beings experience only appearances, not things in themselves. It's even the case that space and time are forms of human intuition and not things in themselves. He calls this thesis transcendental idealism. So this, by the way, is clearly a very speculative view. Many people find this kind of surprising that Kant would say that space and time aren't real in one way of speaking. They aren't things in themselves. They aren't objective. They're actually a part of human perception. All I can say about this particular thesis of Kant is that it's really complicated, and we will actually cover this in more detail much later. I guess the best I can say for now is stay tuned. So to try to understand this, let's go back to a lesson, the one on empiricism and rationalism. You might remember these two camps. And if you recall, this day we actually focus on John Locke there on the left-hand side. And his view was, well, we called it indirect representationalism. And the central idea was that there's an internal world, right, the realm of your ideas, and the external world, and that basically our ideas more or less match the external world. Maybe they're not perfect, but they're close enough. You know, they are, maybe the right word to use is veridical. Our ideas of the world match the world itself, roughly speaking. What Kant is going to say is no, in short. Essentially, Kant is saying that your ideas, the appearances of the world to you, have something imbued in them. There is something added to them by human intuition. And as such, you don't really see the world as it is. As such, there is the world as a thing in itself, the way, you might say, the way it really is, and the world of appearances. So this idea now shouldn't be too foreign to you. We've covered something like this before. The only thing that we're dropping now is that our ideas of the world actually resemble the world. We are dropping that part with Kant. Integral to understanding Kant is understanding the analytic-synthetic distinction. The predicates of analytic statements are somehow included in the subject. For example, all bachelors are male. So the concept of bachelorhood, it includes within it being male, the property of being male. That's just what the definition of a bachelor is. Similarly, in the little image that I have here on the left, that set of polygons just includes an orange pentagon. And so when I say this statement, this set of polygons includes an orange pentagon, the first part of the sentence literally includes the second part, because when I say the set, it already includes me talking about a little orange pentagon, which is this thing that we mentioned in the second part of the sentence. So that's an analytic statement. Synthetic statements somehow synthesize different concepts. For example, all bachelors are happy. If one were to truly believe this statement, they have synthesized the concepts of bachelorhood and happiness in their minds. If you truly believe that sentence, somehow you've combined these two concepts into an intelligible idea, and that's what you're currently thinking about. The example that I like to give for this one is on the left, this little color wheel. Take a look at the violet section. The violet section isn't the red section, and it isn't the blue section, at least not alone. It is the red and the blue section synthesized. That is the only way to conceive or perceive here violet. Similarly, if you want to think about the sentence, the statement, all bachelors are happy, it requires that you synthesize bachelorhood and happiness for it to be intelligible. Also important is the distinction between a priori and a posteriori justification. Justifying a priori knowledge claims doesn't require any particular experience. For example, 2 plus 2 equals 4 doesn't require some empirical observation to be justified. A posteriori statements do require some particular empirical justification. So I know some people like to count physical things when they're counting, but you know that you don't really need any particular observation to know that 2 plus 2 equals 4 is true. I mean, it actually has to do instead with how we define the concept of 2, the concept of addition, the concept of equality, etc., right? But a posteriori statements do require some empirical observation. If I were to ask you, for example, there are 7 pawns in front of you, well, you would say false. And as your justification, you'd say, well, in fact, there's only 5, 4 white ones and 1 black one. So there is something about a posteriori claims that require actual observations. Kant argued that we can make synthetic a priori judgments. In other words, judgments whose justification is independent of experience, but that are objectively true about things in themselves. One of its principal examples is geometry. So of course, if you are, for example, trying to figure out how much fence you need around your little compound that you own, you could just simply take some measurements, and I just say it's a perfect square. Take a measurement of one side and do some, geometry basically, and you'd know exactly how much you need. You don't really have to measure the whole thing. There's some special power in geometry that helps us figure out how to manipulate things in the world, distances in particular, angles as well. So there is something about this a priori discipline, this discipline that we know from reason, this math, that allows you to make inferences, it seems like, to know things about the world itself. So Kant here is suggesting these are both a priori and synthetic, these types of judgments. And this is what he's going to use to build his entire both metaphysics and system of ethics. It is a very complicated argument. Let me just make 2 points here. First point, Kant is so famous for conceiving of math, in particular geometry, as a paradigm of truth, that in books on Euclidean and non-Euclidean space, which I don't know why I've read, but in those kind of books, you will see his name mentioned as kind of a great example of this view. So this is from a book on that topic, Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometry, or conceptions of space. So here we go from the slides. The informal feeling for what constitutes mathematical truth received a novel emphasis from the work of Immanuel Kant. He has come to be regarded as believing that in geometry lay true knowledge of the world, knowledge a priori, and that although some experience was required to obtain it, it was independent of any particular experience. And synthetic, in that its truth was not a matter of logic alone, it could in principle be false. Among the synthetic a priori principles he accepted were geometric axioms. So the relevance here is that Kant is famous for seeing geometry in particular as an example of synthetic a priori statements. The second thing that I want to say is that Kant's system is one of the most complicated systems in all of philosophy, I'd say. And so to get you from synthetic a priori through his metaphysics into his ethics, into his moral philosophy, would take us so long that we actually can't do that in this course. There are entire courses dedicated just to that. What we're going to do is skip now to his moral philosophy, bypassing his metaphysics. Okay, so two concepts here. Deontology is a view that an action's being right or wrong depends on the principle that motivated that action. Consequentialism is a view that an act is right or wrong depending on the consequences of that action. So these will lead to radically different theories, as we will soon see. But let me give you an example to kind of begin to wrap your mind around this. There are probably in this course people who have never, ever taken any kind of recreational drugs. They have never smoked pot or anything of the sort. And they, on principle, will never do so. It happens every single time. That they just know that it's not something that they do, it's not something they want to do. In general, it's not something they think people should do. That would be very close to a deontological position, but now there might be some other people in the class who look at things basically on a case-by-case basis. For example, they might think of someone who engages, for example, in smoking of cannabis, and they say to themselves, well, that person doesn't really hurt anyone. They don't slack off on the job. It looks like they're doing fine. For that person, it's okay to smoke cannabis. But they might look at someone else who perhaps drinks too much and then say, yeah, for that person who drinks too much, who spends too much money on alcohol, who is messing up at work or at school or in their relationship or whatever, for that person, because of the negative consequences, that's actually what makes that person's behavior morally wrong. So one is consequence-driven analysis, and the other one is about rules that, well, we'll give you some ways to arrive at these rules in a second, but it is essentially a rule-driven approach to ethics. Kant is traditionally held as developing a robust, very complicated deontological system. So let's start to get at some of these concepts so you can understand it. First off, the starting point of Kant's ethics is the concept of freedom. The moral agent judges that he can do certain things because he is conscious that he ought, and he recognizes that he is free, a fact which, but for the moral law, he would have never known. So what Scruton here is summarizing for us is that Kant believes that it is our recognition that some things ought not be done that allows us to see that we are actually free, that we have libertarian free will. And perhaps some of us have been put in situations where we had an opportunity to do something that we know is morally wrong, and we've willingly chosen to not do it. That is a true exercise of freedom, or it is a sort of event that allows you to realize that you truly are free. That's what Kant and Scruton are suggesting here. A rational being is a being that can live according to principles. Moral personhood, in other words, the status of having moral rights, is only held by rational beings. So these individuals who are conscious of their freedom, these are the rational beings. And because they can live according to principles, that's what gives them moral status. Now, it turns out that in the bigger picture, most animals don't qualify as rational beings for Kant. And it's the case that really only humans, sort of in the kind of a general analysis, qualify as rational beings. But there is something to be said about this. I mean, Kant isn't saying that you're allowed to hit animals and be abusive or anything like that. If you're really thinking about real moral law, it only applies to those who are actually able to choose the things that they do at a high degree of cognition. I mean, you actually have to pick your principles, and that's something only humans can do. That's why when we watch movies like Finding Nemo, and we see, vegetarian sharks, that's why it's funny to us. We know that sharks can't really choose that, but humans can. Kant argued that there are two distinct realms: the empirical realm, which is the world of appearances that we perceive, and the transcendental realm, or the intelligible realm, the realm of things in themselves. If we are using maybe less technical language, less of the jargon that Kant used, the empirical realm is the internal world, and the transcendental realm is the external world. Now, I don't want to fudge Locke's and Kant's views too much because they are very different, but just to help you remember of what's what, maybe that's a nice little flag we can post there. The reason why this is important is because Kant needs to respond to the problem of free will, which is ancient, so he knew about it. So let me get at this from the slides. The law of cause and effect operates only in the realm of nature, the empirical realm. Freedom, however, belongs not to nature, but precisely to that intelligible or transcendental realm to which categories like causality do not apply. So Kant here is suggesting all these causal laws, those are actually just in the world of appearances. All the laws of nature that we've figured out through physics and such, those only apply to the realm of appearances. But humans are different. Humans are things in themselves. As such, all these causal laws that we would figure out, they actually don't apply to us. Those only apply to the realm of appearances. Instead, we are, again, things in themselves, which means we are free from these causal laws. We are free in the libertarian sense. Note, because Kant's moral system is founded in the transcendental realm, he must rely solely on reason. Now, we've already said that humans are things in themselves, and so they're a part of this realm. That's the only way to understand them. So Kant cannot look at things in the realm of appearances to figure out whether something is morally right or morally wrong. As such, Kant argued that we can arrive at fundamental moral truths through pure reason. We do not need to look at the consequences of the action in the empirical realm to see whether they are right or wrong. In one way, he's kind of bound to say this. He can't say otherwise because of the way he set the whole thing up. But on the other hand, there's something sort of intuitive about this. Now, think about something that's... I'll give you an example, and perhaps this will be a little bit better for you. Think about someone who is plotting on killing their little niece because they stand to inherit a very large sum of money. Now, before I even tell you what ends up happening, does this person actually kill their niece or not, you already got a sense, no, that's wrong. Right? So you actually don't need to look at the ultimate consequences of a thought process or of a given plan of action before you kind of begin to realize whether it is permissible or not. Relatedly, for Kant, an action only has real moral worth, in other words, moral value, if it is done out of duty. Doing something out of duty is to do something because one is motivated out of respect for moral law, even if one doesn't really want to do it. The moral worth of the act is derived not from the consequences of the act, but from the principle or maxim that motivated that act. So the key word here is because. When you do something, let's just say for your mom, the whole idea is that you're doing it not because you don't want to get her mad, and not because you're going to ask her for something later on, but because it's the right thing to do. The action will only have moral worth if you did it because you knew it was the right thing to do. So Kantian ethics here is a lot stricter than other ethical theories. You really can't do something morally right on accident, according to Kantian moral philosophy. Okay, finally we are here at, the name of his theory is the categorical imperative. It has various formulations. I'm going to give you two in this class. There are more, but let me give you two here. The universal law formulation is probably the most famous. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now that probably sounds like word salad to you, and that's actually his second attempt at this. His first book on his moral philosophy was this one, and it was so notoriously unclear that he had to give it a second go at it, and what people call his second critique. But in any case, just to kind of try to begin to wrap our minds around this, let me read this one from the slides. For Kant, to be immoral is to be irrational. Some actions are of such a nature that their maxim cannot even be thought as a universal law of nature without contradiction. The important part here is there's something irrational about immoral behavior. I think for our purposes, we will use a little help from Christine Korsgaard, who's one of my favorite Kantian interpreters. So I've taken this from her work, and you can see links to that on the website. But here is essentially how to use the universal law formulation. Step 1, consider an action. Step 2, consider what principle motivated that action. Step 3, ask yourself, would willing that everyone act upon this principle make it so that I would no longer be able to engage in the action? If yes, the action is morally right. If no, the action is wrong. So maybe an example of this, it has to do with one of my favorite activities to do when I was a teenager. I loved to theater hop. Why would I theater hop? Well, I wanted to watch the movie, but I didn't want to pay for it. That's what motivated me to theater hop. Wanting to watch a movie, not wanting to pay for it. Well, what were to happen if everyone followed my maxim? If you want to do something, you don't have to pay for it, go ahead and do that. Well, if everyone followed that maxim of mine when it comes to movies, guess what wouldn't get made anymore? Movies. Because people would still watch them, as long as they could, but they wouldn't pay for it because no one wants to pay for that, right? So the idea here is my own actions are contradictory. If everyone were to do what I would do, I wouldn't be able to do what I'm currently doing, which is theater hopping. Does that make sense? That's the idea. Some actions literally contradict themselves, and that's how you know they're morally wrong. So we can actually use this same little set of steps to arrive at more or less this table right here. Of course, lying is not universalizable. You can't will that everyone do this, because if everyone lied, well, then communication would be impossible. No one would believe each other anymore, and then you wouldn't be able to lie anymore. So that's contradictory. Stealing, we've already kind of covered that with theater hopping. Let's look at murder. Why is murder self-contradictory? Well, murdering usually occurs because they find the person's life inconvenient to the murderer. So as such, they get rid of them. Well, if everyone were to act on that maxim, everyone would be dead, because everyone's been inconvenient to someone else at least once in their existence. And of course, if everyone does that, well, then there wouldn't be anyone left to murder. Again, contradictory. Note: we have a perfect duty to not act according to maxims which are self-contradictory, for example, stealing. We also have imperfect duties which are supererogatory. In other words, you do not receive moral blame if you don't complete them, but you will get moral praise if you do. For example, developing your talents. So it's a very interesting aspect of Kantianism that he says there's a bunch of things that you just really can't do. And other things that are basically optional. You should do them if you can, but you don't have to. It's not actually required. Okay, so who are some people that think in this way? I'm not entirely sure, but I think maybe Captain America, at least from the comic book version, not from the movies. He might be an example of this kind of rule follower. Probably 3PO is a good example of this one too. Forrest Gump seems pretty rule-oriented as well. There are some things you do, some things you don't do, and that's just it. Maybe Ned Flanders is probably the best example of this general idea. So perhaps some famous Kantians here. Okay, I mentioned there are multiple formulations of this categorical imperative. This is the second one that I'll be covering. Again, there are more. The humanity formulation. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. A very simple way of putting this is don't use people. Now, if you take a look at the table that we made earlier, anything on that right column is an example of using someone. Down there, drug abuse, that's an example of using yourself as a means to an end, to get pleasure, basically. So that is another way of arriving at what is morally permissible and what is not, according to Kant. Kant says, by the way, that those two formulations are equivalent. They're basically saying the same thing. The third formulation, he says, is also equivalent, but I only cover that in my ethics course. Okay, let's look at some quick problems with Kantian ethics, and then we'll get to the next big problem. Some scholars claim that Kant is too reliant on reason. Around the same time as Kant's writing, there was a strong tradition of sentimentalist philosophers who built their moral theories based on moral emotions. Anthropologist Robin Fox claims that academia is currently still being harmed by a quasi-divinical treatment, in other words, worship, of reason that began in the Enlightenment. The previous paragraphs are taken, in fact, from a previous book. There also I said that any of these diatribes are only contribution to a larger project, the aim of which is to free us from the intellectual shackles of the Enlightenment faith and reason, the romantic passion for the individual, and the 19th century worship of progress. But it is worth saying over and over again, because no one gets it the first time. Fox here, in the book that was in the previous slide, is really criticizing this whole faith and reason, and he stresses the word faith, because it sort of took over our whole way of thinking for a while, and it's not exactly as scientifically rigorous as it should be. Here are some other problems with Kantian ethics, though, even beyond this over-reliance on reason. even if we can resolve all these issues, there's still the fact that Kantian ethics appear to be too strict. So remember that table that I made? Well, that right column, those things that are morally impermissible, you are never allowed to do any of those under any circumstances. But it seems like, just one example, lying could be innocent. They call them little white lies. It seems like in those cases, is it really morally wrong to say a little white lie that doesn't really harm anyone? It might actually make someone feel better. Is that really wrong? Kant says yes. He doubles down. Another thing, Kantianism is too vague when duties conflict. For example, what happens if you have to lie to save a life? Ooh, well, you're not supposed to lie, and you are supposed to save lives. What are you supposed to do in this case? And it seems like you actually have to just let the person die because lying is not allowed. Now, Kant's moral philosophy, as well as his metaphysics, they really are heroic. What he's trying to establish through his transcendental deduction, that's what he calls it, it really is impressive, whether or not he's successful. Now, we can't get into that here, but it really is an impressive moral theory. That's one way that people get to know the work of Kant, with how ambitious it was. There is another way that people encounter Kantianism, and that is through its bitter rivalry with a very popular ethical theory. The ethical theory that we're going to cover next, and one that is very, very controversial, is utilitarianism. I'll see you next time.